Soviet from Stanford University in 1986. He was a Rhodes Scholar and received a PhD in International Relations at Oxford in 1991. He's currently director at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. He's also professor of international studies in Stanford's Department of Political Science, and he's a senior fellow as well at the Hoover Institution. And he's been at Stanford with, I guess, some time off for good behavior to serve the country since 1995. Professor McFaul is author of a number of books. I think most of you will be familiar with some of his work. Most recently, a New York Times bestseller. I hadn't realized that. Congratulations on that. I'm glad to see that people are interested and are reading such insightful work on this topic. The book is entitled From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. He's written a number of other books, including Advancing Democracy Abroad, Why We Should, How We Can, and Russia's Unfinished Revolution, Political Change from Gorbachev to Putin. Professor McFaul served in the Obama administration for 5 years. He was special assistant to the president and senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs on the National Security Council at the White House from 2009 to 2012. And then he served as ambassador to the Russian Federation in 2012 to 2014, an interesting and difficult period. Among his other assignments and responsibilities, Dr. McFaul is an international affairs analyst for NBC News, and he's a columnist for the Washington Post. And his current research interests include American foreign policy, great power relations, and the relationship between democracy and development. And as some of you may have heard in the chat just briefly at the beginning, he's currently doing work on great power competition in the 21st century. So Professor McFaul, Ambassador McFaul, it's a real pleasure to welcome you, and the floor is now yours. I would ask everyone just to mute their microphones. Cameras are optional. And as Bailey said, as questions occur to you, please send them in the chat and I will pass them on to Professor McFaul.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Friedberg. Thank you, Bailey, for having me. I think I misread the invitation in my defense. I think I thought it was 9 a.m. Palo Alto time, being California-centric as I am, but it's great to be with you. You have a truly fantastic lineup today of a lot of specialists throughout the day, and it made me nervous. I want to tell you honestly, like, what could I say that would be of interest to this group and would add value? So what I decided to do is focus more on diagnostics and what I consider to be the central threat to European security, which is Russia. And so what I want to do in my talk today, and I know we have a lot of time, so hopefully I won't talk that much and we can get to your questions. I want to talk about the diagnostics of the Russia threats, kind of as first, how did we get here? Second, a brief snapshot of where I think we're at right now. And then third, but very 30,000 feet-ish, talk about some prescriptions, because I know for the rest of the day, we have a lot of people that will speak about that part in a way that's more expert than I am. I've been doing a lot of talking on Zoom. I'm sure we all have. And I've learned that you should bring photos so that you don't have to look at me. So let me try to share my screen right now. And can I just confirm that you can see that? Okay, great. So let me jump in. So, like I said, Russia threat, diagnostics, and prescriptions. I want to start by reminding you where we were just 30 years ago. And that will give you a sense of how I see this threat and how I see this new challenge today. For me, the end of the Cold War was a truly glorious moment. This is Reagan and Gorbachev in '88, but this is '89, Helmut Kohl and Gorbachev. This is Czechoslovakia, just to remind our younger viewers who don't know this history. Russia 1991, that was a great day. I'm actually there. If you look really hard, you can see me. And by the way, Vladimir Putin knew that I was there. I'll come back to that later. And, I just want to remind everybody that it wasn't inevitable. It wasn't always the case that Russia was considered an enemy of the West, or enemy of NATO, or enemy of the United States. And now here we are, where, as we were just discussing, I'm following and learning about the US-China debate and new Cold War or not. For those of us who've been involved in the Russia debate, we've been using this compare and contrast with the Cold War for several years now. Ed Lucas, I think, wrote his book in 2008, just so you know, but Medvedev comparing where we're at to 1962, even Donald Trump talked about the new Cold War. That's a long ways away from where we were just 30 years ago. Now, if we had more time, and I'll come back to this really complicated slide later if you're interested, we could do a deeper dive of the compare and contrast to the Cold War. In my view, some things are similar and some things are different, and we need to acknowledge both of those things and not just be in one camp or the other. Let me take three of them just to get into that. And as I do, I want to challenge you to think about whether we're better off or worse off today than in the late Cold War period. The first couple of decades of the Cold War, I would not want to go back to, of course, but comparing today versus a more stable period in the Cold War, it's hard to say whether it's better or for worse. So good news, bad news. The good news, the bad news from the Cold War is we had a quantitative nuclear arms race, highly destabilizing, wasted a lot of money, in my view, as well on that. The good news is that's over. We're no longer building nuclear arsenals because of the New START Treaty. We're actually bringing them down. The cap now in the New START Treaty is 1550. By the way, you can still blow up the entire world with 1,500 nuclear weapons. So I think we have a long ways to go, but that's better than 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, depending on how you counted these weapons during the Cold War. The bad news from today is that we're in a new qualitative arms race. Now, we always were in a qualitative part during the Cold War, but today there are certain weapons, including the new Poseidon weapon that the Russians rolled out, told us about publicly a couple of years ago, but has been in production and design for many decades. A nuclear weapon that's designed to go through the ocean and then explode right before it gets to the coast. I live on the coast, so it focused my mind when I was first briefed about it. And then it's supposed to explode and it's supposed to drown the people on the coast. That's kind of new. That's different. That's scary. Same with missile defenses, I would say. Qualitative arms race there. Same with cyber weapons. That's different and maybe not as stabilizing as other times. Second, ideological struggle. The good news is that the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism is over. Yes, there are pockets, here in the Bay Area where they talk about it. My colleagues at Berkeley and on Fox News, they want to tell you that there's a battle between communism and capitalism, but I don't see it. It's not real. But the bad news is that there is a new ideological struggle, which I'll spend more time on later in my talk, between what I call conservative nationalism or illiberal ideas and the Western liberal democratic world. And the way that Putin is fighting this is not just between states, but within states, including, by the way, the United States of America. Good or bad, better or worse, you tell me. And then finally, on this compare and contrast, the good news is that we are not fighting proxy wars throughout the entire world as we did during the Cold War. The Cold War actually was not cold. It was very hot. Millions of people died in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Thankfully, that is not happening. But in this new era, there are new instruments of competition and new practices that we didn't even see during the Cold War. Annexation, for instance, we fought World War II in large measure because of annexation, and throughout the Cold War, there was not much of it. Now it's back after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Sanctions, there are more Russians today on the sanctions list than any time in US Soviet or US Russian history. And there are more Americans on that list. I know, because I'm one of them. And then you get into these new kinds of methods, assassinations and cyber attacks, including what happened here in the United States in 2016. That's a somewhat new thing. We did not see that kind of interaction in terms of competition. So, compare and contrast, I think we would all agree, however, that it's a real threat, a tragic threat, and most certainly not anything like the euphoric times that we had at the end of the Cold War. So the first thing I want to do, and I'm going to do this quickly because this is rehearsing some things I've written about earlier and then get to where we're at today, is just for a moment spend, a little bit of time figuring out what the heck happened between the glory days of the end of the Cold War and that photo on the right, which is of Vladimir Putin, President Putin and President Obama. That's in Los Cabos, Mexico. I was at that meeting, summer of 2012. And let me tell you, the meeting itself was a lot worse than that photo. And it's never really turned around ever since. So what happened? And again, I'm going to do this very quickly. We can come back to this in questions if people want to. But I think there are three big explanations that one has to think about in order to properly diagnose the nature of the Russian threat today to Europe, and I would say to the liberal democratic world. So one, which should be familiar to this group, so I won't take too much time on it. This is just normal. Russia was weak, Russia collapsed, Soviet Union collapsed and Russia reemerged. Russia's now back. Russia has capabilities to do things that it didn't. And so Russia's just behaving again like your normal great power. And this is a map I use when I teach about this. We're just racing through 1,000 years of European history here. And, what's happening? Countries are getting stronger, countries are getting weaker, and the borders are changing. By the way, it takes several more minutes before Crimea becomes part of Russia, but we're not going to watch that. Not with this crowd. We won't watch that any longer. So, this is just what's new under the sun. Russia's back. Russia's a big power. They're just behaving like a great power again. And I'll say more about their power capabilities later in my talk. And I want to be clear, this is the baseline with we have to address the Russia threat today. Of course, power matters. Without power and without Russian power today, capabilities today, we would not be talking about Russia today. You didn't ask me to come give a talk about the threat from Moldova to European security. I don't mean to pick on Moldova. I love Moldova. It's a great country. I actually went there with the vice president, who's now the president, and we had a great time there. But nobody's worried about that because nobody's worried about their capabilities. Russia has the capabilities to annex Crimea, to intervene in Syria, to intervene in our elections in 2016. Those are real power capabilities that most countries in the world don't have. But I don't think it's the whole story for two reasons. One, I can think of some countries that have risen in power that have not challenged Europe, the West, and the international system more broadly. Europe and Japan, Germany and Japan, of course, after World War II. Lots of people wrote after the collapse of the Soviet Union that we would have the return of balance of power politics in Europe. That didn't happen. And even today, and I was going to delete this because when I knew Aaron was going to be here, I would normally not have that bullet point. But in my view, China is even less revisionist than Russia is today, even though Russia is much less powerful. So there's that problem. But then there's the problem of why, recently, why didn't this pivot take this confrontational period take place earlier? Because Russia most certainly had these capabilities a lot earlier than our current conflictual era. And therefore, to fill out the story, I think you need a few more factors. The second one is one very popular in Moscow, of course, which is it's all our fault. And here, the hour is really on the Americans, but it's collectively shared with our European allies. And this is a story about how we took advantage of Russia's weakness after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We expanded NATO, we bombed Serbia, we invaded Iraq, we supported color revolutions, and finally, Russia had to push back. It was just enough is enough. We've got to stop this imperial behavior by the United States and their allies. And I want to be clear, every single one of these events happened, And every single one of these events caused tensions in U.S.-Russian and U.S.-European, U.S.-Russian relations and Russian-NATO relations without question. But it's more complicated than that, and this gets to the time I was in the government, that after all of those events, we had a new cooperative period with Russia. It's pretty transactional, I would say. It was about seeking what Obama used to call win-win outcomes. It was not broader than that. I think there's a big misconception that we were hoping to improve relations or transform Russia. That was most certainly not my view at the time. But during this period, from 2009 to 2012, we actually got a lot of things done. We signed the New START Treaty. That was a great day. That's in Prague. And then we got it ratified, by the way. That's very difficult to do these days. That's the day that we got the votes in the Senate to do that. We developed the Northern Distribution Network to reduce our dependence on Pakistan for fighting the war in Afghanistan, which was pretty important when we violated Pakistani sovereignty in 2011 to kill Osama bin Laden. We put in place multilateral sanctions against Iran, the most comprehensive set of sanctions ever in 2010. Could not have done that without Russia. And we managed some so-called color revolutions. I call these non-events. You probably don't remember the Kyrgyz color revolution in 2010, but I do. Super scary event when the government collapsed there. 300,000 people left Kyrgyzstan. And it felt like we were going to get into a Cold War struggle proxy war because we had a military base there. But that didn't happen because we were cooperating with the Russians at the time. And I'll just skip this. Every one of these boxes represents hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of my life. But even on the economic side, things were going in the right direction. Even people thought things were going in the right direction, peaking at 60% favorability rate for the United States during the reset, and likewise, pretty high numbers here in the United States. And, you know, we don't need to go into any more detail on that, other than for me to say that all of that cooperation happened after these events that allegedly drove us to the Cold War competition we're in today. And that doesn't make any sense to me. It means that something had to happen in the intervening years for our current conflictual period today, not just these factors from the past. And that gets me to my last variable factor that I want to focus on in terms of why we are in this confrontational moment with Russia today. And I want to dig in just briefly to some domestic politics within Russia. Because I think, you know, together with power, this gives you a complete explanation for where we are today. And a critical moment that, at least it seemed critical to me, although this is very highly contested debate among Russia followers in the West, was the confluence of two events in a period of 6 months. The first event was when Vladimir Putin announced to the world in September of 2011 that he was going to run for a third term as president. And then just a few months later, there was a parliamentary election in Russia, falsified under normal terms, normal terms, that came out wrong. Ways that were very typical. That's the way I would describe that. We didn't think much of it, frankly, when I was working. I was at the time still at the White House. But this time around, because of smartphones and VKontakte and Facebook and Twitter, there was mass mobilization in Moscow and St. Petersburg in particular. But the biggest demonstrations you've had in Russia since 1991. And the combination of those two things had, I think, a pretty profound impact on the way Putin perceived the outside world. And I want to be clear, if I had more time in another talk, we could talk about the evolution of Putin's ideas. I am not of the view that he had the same views for the last 20 years. I see an evolution there. And I'm going to talk about the endpoint and not the process in a minute. But I also believe that his views and Medvedev's views were actually radically different, having sat in the room with both of those leaders for 5 years, usually with President Obama, sometimes with Vice President Biden. And it was very striking to us when we would meet them, even though they worked together. And obviously, Putin was the principal actor in this relationship. But the win-win outcomes that we were pursuing with Medvedev, and I think he himself kind of quietly thought of himself as a Western modernizer, it was very different talking to Putin. He doesn't think about win-win outcomes when, generally speaking, I don't think he thinks in those terms, most certainly not with respect to the United States. He thinks of us as a competitor and now as an enemy. And this third bullet point here is most important. Putin has this theory about American power and Western power. I'm using that interchangeably, so forgive me for being so American-centric at a conference about Europe. But he's got this theory that, we go around the world and we use our power to overthrow regimes that we don't like. And, let's be clear, there's a lot of empirical data to support that hypothesis about American foreign policy over the last several decades. And we actually had a pretty deep and sometimes heated debate about it the first time that President Obama met then Prime Minister Putin. This is out at Putin's dacha in July 2009, where Putin came loaded for this meeting and he wanted to tell Obama about all of the mistakes, especially Professor Friedberg, that the Bush administration made. He had many, many mistakes that the Bush administration made. He had lots of praise, just so you know, for President Bush. He really has a fond spot for the president. But it was the deep states, it was the CIA, the Pentagon, Vice President Cheney. He's got that theory that there's this cohort of people that run American foreign policy. Presidents come and go, but this deep state was driving it. And Obama tried to say, hey, you're wrong about that. But more importantly, he tried to say, I'm different. And in particular, when we got to that debate about the Iraq war and Putin said, you guys were idiots to invade and look at the mess you created there. Obama said, you're right. And that, by the way, that was very jarring for Putin. He'd never heard an American say that, right? And he said, I'm different. We're not going to do that. We're not going to be involved in regime change. And I remember as we were walking out to the cars, Putin kind of was thinking, well, maybe this guy will be different. But then fast forward a little bit, just several months later, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and for Putin, these events were confirming data to support his hypothesis about the United States fomenting revolution against regimes that they don't like. This is all 2011. And then remember that election and that protest that I talked about earlier happened in exactly the same year, December 2011. And to remind you, as I said before, the last time you had that many people on the streets of Moscow was 20 years earlier, the year that the Soviet Union collapsed, the year that there was regime change in Moscow. And that's when Putin, I think, decided that, we were out to get him, that he needed a new argument to mobilize his domestic constituents at home. And this is always an argument we have, was it instrumental or genuine? The way he described what we were trying to do against his regime. I'm happy to dig into that later. But without question, even before I arrived as ambassador in January 2012, he had pivoted hard to this argument that we were mobilizing and supporting and funding the revolution against his regime inside Russia. And I'll just go through this quickly, but even before the demonstrations happened, he was starting to talk about this stuff. And then after the demonstrations happened, he went into full gear and full throttle argument about this. And by the way, this is exactly when I arrived as the ambassador. And as one of his colleagues said to me, so Mike, you're like manna from heaven, given what you said and who your friends are about democracy and democratic activists here in Russia. And he said, don't take it personally when we go after you, but you're going to be the focal point. You're going to be the poster child of this anti-American campaign. Remember, Putin was still running for office at the time. And I literally became the poster child, just so you see here, during this period. Here's some other posters of my own personal experience with this pivotal moment. I'm going to skip that video for now. But I think that was the end of the reset. That was the end of cooperation with Russia, punctuated by then, I think the real pivot for Putin was one more mobilization, right? So you see the pattern here, right? This time in Ukraine, this time against a close ally of his, Mr. Yanukovych. And when Yanukovych finally fled Ukraine and wound up in Rostov in Russia, that's when I think Putin decided, I'm no longer interested in engaging with these folks. They are the enemy. And that's when I think he pivoted hard to the position that he's in now. And has continued to blame us for this and this and this to this day. So if you accept my explanation for the why here, the diagnosis, I think there's a good news, bad news point, and then I'll pivot to where we're at today and a few brief remarks about things we should do. I think there's a good news, bad news story to my analysis. One, most importantly, I do not think we are destined forever to be in conflict with Russia because of culture or the balance of power or these historical causes of conflict between Russia and the West. My view is, and my argument, that it has much more to do with much more contingent factors, including Putin's leadership himself. Secondly, I also don't see a leader in the Kremlin today that has some master plan to recreate the Soviet Union. I think especially Ukraine and especially what he did against us in 2016 were much more tactical, emotional reactions and not some grand plan to recreate the Soviet Union, let alone to intervene in Russia. Europe. That said, I think there's also some pretty bad news here. Putin is convinced that the West is his enemy, and I don't think it's instrumental. When I got to Moscow, I used to debate this with Obama all the time. I was of the view that it was just instrumental, that it was just he needed us for domestic mobilization purposes, and he really didn't believe all the kind of propaganda that they would say about us. I left Moscow in 2014 with a very different analysis, that actually Putin does think we are out to get him. He does think the CIA has incredible capabilities. By the way, let me be clear. The CIA does have incredible capabilities, just not the kinds of capabilities or the kinds of actions that he attributes to them, or to me, for that matter, in the way that he used to describe me. And he, I think, sees for the rest of his time in power that he wants to lead the illiberal international, right? The anti-coalition against the decadent European West and the liberal international order, more broadly speaking. He talks about liberalism dying. He talks about the rise of populist, nationalist, conservative ideas that he supports in his country as the new ideas for the 21st century. And when you get to be his age in life, you're not going to change your mind about that. And then I would just add that Russia has become more autocratic, as we all know, and I think he'll be in power for a long, long time. But I'm out of date. I haven't read recently about what he does with his health today, but back when I worked in Moscow, we calculated that he spent 2 to 3 hours in the gym every morning. He didn't start his work day until well after noon. And so that gets us to where we're at today. And in my view, the Putin challenge, the Russian challenge, I think he's more powerful than many people think. I think he's more ideologically motivated than many think. I think he's more revisionist than many think. And he has a higher tolerance for risk. We constantly think, oh, he would never do that because he would never, he would never annex territory. He would never intervene in our elections. He would never try to kill somebody in a NATO country, as he did in 2018 against Sergei Skripal. He would never order bounties allegedly on American soldiers in Afghanistan. And yet time and time again, I think we find ourselves surprised by his tolerance for risky behavior. And I want to be clear, by the way, if you've read some of my own writings on this, particularly on the power piece, I've changed my views on this. I used to think that, not unlike what Obama said, that Russia is just this regional power and they're a fading power. I don't believe that anymore. So I want to spend literally 5 more minutes talking about that and then some implications, and then we'll get to your questions. So I'm going to go through this quickly, just this kind of power, a few numbers. My point here is not that Russia is a superpower. My point is not that Russia is as powerful along many dimensions as the United States or China. My point here is that Russia is a great power, at least a middle power, and has enough power to do damaging things, particularly in Europe. So, when we compare Russia globally, they don't look very threatening. When we compare Russian military forces on the border of NATO, they look a lot more threatening. And so let me just go through this quickly. Obviously, they're the only other nuclear power in the world. I think that's always important to remember, and that is important for their self-identity. On the conventional side, they're well below the United States and China, but they're in the top ranks here, folks. They're not, they've not faded away. It's not Burkina Faso with nuclear weapons, as people used to say. And over the last 15 to 20 years of the Putin era, the percentage of his GDP, which is a much smaller GDP than ours, has been consistently higher spent on military than either the United States or China. And in some dimensions of conventional power, this is a pretty complicated slide for this early in the morning, but they have made real investments in modernization in particular. This, again, another complicated slide, but just look at that middle graph there, which is, the Western district, the Western military district of Russia and NATO forces. And the balance of power looks rather troubling. And I'll say more about this in a minute. It's Russian global power is, they are not a global power, as Barack Obama said one time, and really offended Putin when he said that. But in this theater, they are most certainly one of the most important powers, and I think a rather frightening power, getting more and more frightening by the day. And again, economic power, just the traditional measures of power. Russia is not a great power, right? They're way behind the United States, European Union, and China. But in terms of PPI, they're a mid-range power, right? They're 6th, they're not 25th. And that number, I think, will be stable for a long, long time in ways that the German number and Japanese number might not be stable. And GDP per capita, of course, they're also way behind the United States, European Union, or Germany. But GDP per capita terms, they're right there with China. So again, not a great power, but not this poor country, this poor desolate country that I think a lot of people have in their minds when they think of Russia. And then the last piece on this part, I just want to remind you that as a total pie, of course, the Russian economy is much smaller than the United States and many of our European allies. But of that pie, Putin controls a whole lot more of it, and therefore can channel it not just to his cronies, but also to these more coercive measures and these more coercive parts of the economy and the intelligence services in ways that President Biden, for instance, does not have the same control and the same ownership even of the American economy. And then cyber power, just to note, I think we've all been, this is a common knowledge now, but remember, when you do have a lot of control over these resources, you can invest them where you see fit, and we shouldn't be surprised that a former KGB intelligence officer has put tremendous resources into enhancing these capabilities for Russia. And then second on the snapshot, I just want to spend a little bit of time making the case, and this is controversial, a lot of people don't agree with me on this, but I think it's not just that Russia has capabilities to do things. I also think that Putin is motivated ideologically to do things. And that over the course of his career, he's become much more focused on his ideology, Putinism, or illiberal ideas. And not only has he deepened his thinking about that, in concert, by the way, with his country becoming more autocratic, but then he's invested in instruments for actually exporting those ideas. So let me spend about 2 minutes on this. So this part, I think, is common knowledge. That's nothing interesting. I would tell you, and I think it's very important to understand, Russia today is way more autocratic than it was when Putin first became president. It's actually way more autocratic by most measures of professional groups that do these kinds of comparisons than even the year 2011, 2012. That's happened in Putin's third and fourth term. Likewise, Russia has become less market friendly, especially in these latter years. Putin actually was a very classic neoliberal thinker when he first became president, or at least he had neoliberal thinkers in his government. In later years of his life, and especially now, he's moved in a much more populist mode in terms of his economic policies, and he's much more frightened or concerned about the private sector, not only the Western private sector, but the Russian private sector itself. And redistribution of property rights depends on which measure you use, but anywhere from 40% of the economy was controlled by the government in one way or another when he first took over. Now, some estimate that to be as high as 60%. And then mature Putinism, again, we could talk about the evolution in questions if you're interested, but I think today he has a coherent set of ideas, and I would describe them as orthodox conservative values against what he would call liberal democratic Western values. And on the international side, if there is such a thing as the liberal international order, if there is. John Eikenberry is with us. So there most certainly is something called the liberal international order, because Professor Eikenberry's here. He sees that as just an extension of American imperialism, American hegemony, and is quite focused if you look at what he says, in trying to chip away at its destruction. And I won't go through this stuff now because I've talked longer even than I wanted to, but I'd be happy to talk about some of what I think are some pretty critical things he said about this stuff. You know, he conflates, of course, orthodoxy and religious values with conservative values, and contrasts that with liberalism, right? Now, we all know there's a much larger debate, I would say, philosophically, about conservative values versus liberal values. But in Putin's world, it is pretty black and white. And that's at least the way he talks about it. I don't know what he actually thinks, of course, but that's the way he talks about it. Same with his nationalism, using, phrases like this to say, and invoking, of course, for the Russian people, the most important enemy of all time, which is the Nazis, and creating this imagery that Russia, again, is under siege from the West, just like we were during World War II, as a way to invoke and to stimulate nationalist sentiment within Russia. But this is the more controversial part that I want to just spend 2 minutes on before talking about some prescriptions. It'd be one thing if he was just focused on doing that at home. But I think if you look at Russian foreign policy over the last couple of decades, you see an increasing effort by Putin to go on the offensive. So if in the first decade of his power in Russia, he was really concentrated on consolidating autocratic power within Russia and developing his ideas there about conservative values, sovereign democracy, managed democracy, were some of the euphemisms that he used back then. I think in the last decade, he has invested increasingly in instruments to export these ideas abroad. And I just want to remind you of the list and then talk about implications. So this, I think, will be familiar with this crowd, but I would just say you don't invest in things like Russia Today or bots and fake identities and IRA and fomenting division in countries, including our own, if you don't have some view about these ideologies that they are propagating. Likewise, you don't engage with very systematically, I would say, throughout Europe, especially with certain kinds of people with certain kinds of ideas. If you're just thinking about balance of power politics, I think Putin has a whoops, I misspelled international there at 5:45 a.m. this morning. But you see, I think, a rather sophisticated strategy for courting leaders within countries that share his worldview, including, of course, Donald Trump in our country over the last 4 years. In parallel, and here they've learned some things from American activities here, they have these society to society ties that they've been developing. I think this is pretty weak stuff so far, but they have studied the National Endowment for Democracy. They have studied what Americans do in these domains, and they are actively seeking to try to do that themselves around the world. And then, of course, ultimately, the most coercive way to export your ideas, Putin has not been afraid to do that as well. And then finally, I think, and here again, I would have had a different view several years ago, but I think we need to acknowledge that he's been rather successful in this, in ways that surprise me. That is Putinism and this transnational set of ideas have not died away, as I would have thought they might have after he invaded Ukraine. On the contrary, he has continued to push these ideas in Europe. And I want to be clear, when I say Europe, I mean Belarus is part of Europe, Ukraine is part of Europe, Georgia is part of Europe. And when I look at the map today of where Putin's allies are doing well and where Democratic allies or liberal allies are doing well in that part of the world especially, you could feel pretty smug if you're Putin. You might feel like, to use an old Soviet phrase, that the correlation of forces is on his side. And so, with one big setback, of course, the loss of Donald Trump. That was a huge setback for what he was trying to do. This is a poster from Russia, by the way, from 2016. That's Le Pen in the middle, for those that don't recognize. That's a great shot of President Trump, by the way. That's a big setback. And obviously, whether we are at the beginning of a new phase where populism begins to die out or not, there are people more expert than I at this meeting with you, but that will have huge implications for the opportunities that Putin might have in the future. Most certainly here domestically, his opportunities have been radically rolled back because of the election of President Biden. All right, I've gone on longer than I thought. I was told to speak for about an hour, and I didn't think I could do that this early in the morning, but I have. So let me just go through this quickly, because I think you'll spend a lot of the rest of the day talking about what is to be done. And here is my kind of 30,000 feet assessment of what the West should do vis-a-vis Russia for as long as Putin stays in power. And I'll just, at a very high level, go through what I think are the key components of what I call a strategy for dealing towards Russia. And I think it has to be strategic. I think it has to be multiple dimensional. And I think it has to be put in place for a long, long time. And I think we have elements of it. And starting in 2014, But I also worry because of other priorities, both in Europe and especially here in the United States, that we might forget about the fact that we do have this challenge. So one, just deterrence, peace through strength. I think we are in the right track there, but I still worry a lot about this track. And here's what I worry about. I do not worry about Russian tanks rolling into Tallinn. I think the probability of that is pretty close to zero. What I do worry about is, something happening in Narva, a city on the border of Estonia. A bunch of drunk Estonians and drunk Russians getting in a bar fight. I was once hit in a bar fight in Tallinn in 1985. That's why I use this analogy. I was doing nothing. I want to be clear. I was just minding my own business, and somebody thought I was a Finn and a Russian guy. So young men tend to do that from time to time. And let's say somebody gets hurt, really hurt, and there's a casualty. What if some Russian special forces come in and exact revenge and then leave? That's the scenario I worry about in terms of deterrence. Would we go to war with Russia over that kind of scenario? And what happens to the alliance if something like that happens? Again, I think it's a low probability event, but it's not a zero probability event. And likewise, I don't want to name countries because I get in trouble. I did that already with Moldova. But imagine a coup somewhere in the Balkans in a NATO country that 99% of Americans don't even know is a NATO ally. And then imagine that we find out that it was orchestrated by Russian intelligence services. What do we do then? What do our German allies do then? What does President Le Pen do if it's President Le Pen in the future? Those are scenarios that worry me. And those are the scenarios I know that Putin thinks about, not as a way to get into a military conflict with NATO, but as a way to erode confidence and solidarity within the alliance. Second, I firmly believe we should lift sanctions on Russia when Putin changes his behavior. I think lifting sanctions before then would be a terrible signal of weakness within the EU and our coordinated efforts so far. I think we would be wise to be clear to the Russian people that these sanctions are not against them and not designed to foment regime change. But I do think it's important to keep these sanctions in place, even if they have not had the effect of changing Putin's behavior as we had hoped for. Third, I could give a whole talk on this slide, but let me just say, if Putin is involved in exporting his illiberal ideas, I think we need to get much more serious about thinking about how to support, first defend, and then support liberal ideas. I think we've gotten out of this habit, and we have not rethought some of our central assumptions from 30 years ago. And I think together with our allies in Europe, our democratic allies, we could be doing a whole lot more to rethinking the strategies for doing this. These are just some ideas, but I'm happy to dig into this more in questions. And then within that, I think we are in a defensive period with respect to democracy around the world, liberalism around the world. And so I think we need to act more defensively. And I think what is happening in Ukraine and Georgia today is scary. I think the probabilities of democratic breakdown in both those countries is much higher today than just 2 or 5 or even 15 years ago. We are not focused on the struggle within those countries to the extent that we should be, in my view. And therefore, if we're in this more ideological moment vis-a-vis Russia, instead of, if I were in charge of like the USAID budget, for instance, for the region, I would just put all of our efforts in these 2 countries and double down to try to consolidate what is there, as opposed to funding things all over, including, by the way, in autocratic societies. I think defense is the order of the day right now. Fourth, I think this is just another way of another bite at the apple about getting more involved in this battle of ideas. But again, I just feel like we've kind of been asleep at the wheel at this. Most certainly it felt that way when I was ambassador long ago, and much has changed. I don't know the debate inside Europe as well as I should. I do know the debate within the Biden administration about this is real, and that's good. And I hope that some of the more ambitious ideas that have been floated will be engaged in terms of what we should do more in this space. And that includes our US-funded media organizations as well. And then final two things. Like the Cold War, I also believe that we should have limited engagement with the Russian government when our interests overlap. We did that during the Cold War. We should do it with Russia today. I don't see a big agenda there. I want to be clear about that. I think the agenda for the possibility of engagement for win-win outcomes is much more, has shrunk a lot compared to when I was in the government. But when it is there, we should pursue it. And in particular, we should do so in multilateral forums where I think it's easier for us to engage with Russia than in bilateral talks. And then again, radically to rethink how we continue to try to expand engagement with Russians, not the Russian government. And here I would just say, we are dealing with a regime that does not want us to do this. So this field of engagement has become much more challenging. But I think that requires, therefore, a much greater thinking about how to do it in different ways. And then finally, I would just say we have to stay the course. I don't think anything's going to change anytime soon. I think the prospects for fundamental change will only emerge after Putin, and I don't know when that will be. And it may not even emerge after Putin. So I think we need to be in this game for the long haul. And I say that tragically because I was one of those who believed 30 years ago that there was a different way forward with Russia with respect to its relations with democracy markets in the West. And with that, I think I'll stop talking. Yes, thank you so much for listening that long, and I'm look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Lots of food for thought. Many questions coming in, and I'm going to try to field them. If you don't hear your question, I apologize. We have, Bailey, I think we have exactly half an hour. We go till 10:30. So Professor McFaul, let me start with a question about your interpretation of Putin's strategy. And I guess it's twofold. One, does he have an end game? What is, and if so, what is it? What is the objective? Or is he just trying to kick the can down the road and maintain his regime and continue to live as nicely as he does until all that exercise doesn't no good or causes him to drop dead? And then a related question, how risk acceptant do you think he really is? You mentioned, for example, the development of Russia's conventional capabilities, which are impressive, certainly along their own borders. And back at the time of the Ukraine events and Russian action in Ukraine, there was real concern about possible future Russian use of force against the Baltic countries, for example. How seriously do you assess the risk of that kind of activity?
Yeah, so great questions. In terms of the grand strategy, I want to keep emphasizing, I think it's evolved. I met Putin in the spring of 1991. So we go way back. And I followed his career, and then I dealt with him in the government episodically when I was in the government. And I think that's important to understand that it's changed, right? In a couple of ways. One is, I do think I mean, all leaders, all autocratic leaders, maybe all leaders to the best of their abilities want to stay in power. And so survivability, of course, is the baseline, right? And I think we get confused by that sometimes. People sometimes say, well, he just wants to stay in power. Well, of course he wants to stay in power. That's not a brilliant observation. But once you think you have the ability to stay in power, that's when his ambition in terms of his end game, I think, has grown over time. And he continues to be, he's still insecure about his ability to stay in power at home, and has grown more insecure, I would say, over time. That's why he feels compelled to arrest Navalny, for instance. He didn't feel compelled to arrest Navalny a decade ago. But at the same time, I think his own self-identity has changed. I mean, I think he thinks of himself as one of the great, he's the guy that restored Russia in a way that, very few other leaders in Russian history have done. And he's very proud of that fact. And I think he already thinks that is his place in history. But I also think he now thinks of himself as the leader of this illiberal international that I was talking about. He thinks of himself as the anchor of it. Again, like I said, a decade ago, he used to talk that way. And then, he's had some successes, right? And that then has a kind of self-enforcing way for him to think, well, maybe there is something bigger here, right? And that's where I think he is today. Having said all that, this use of the word ideology and Putinism, I don't want to exaggerate it. I don't want to say that it's a coherent set of ideas like liberalism or communism. Although, having just said that, I also want to remind people that we tend to oversimplify how coherent the ideas of communism were during the Cold War, right? We think that it was all very coherent and consistent. It wasn't. It was messy, as you know. And his ideas are messy, but they're ideas, is what I want to say. And they're first and foremost a set of anti-ideas, anti-liberalism, and multilateralism. But within that, I think there are a set of coherent ideas, and he wants to be the supporter of them. And then there's one more piece, which I'd be curious how you think about it. But I can't go to Russia anymore, so I go to Beijing from time to time. We'll see how long that lasts. But I spent two of the last 4 summers there working on kind of Russia-China relations. So I'm just dabbling on the Chinese perspective, but on the Russia perspective, Russia, Putin, I shouldn't have said Russia. Putin thinks he's a leader of the illiberal international, and he wants to bring China into that. He wants China to join forces, and he's been very, he likes the dynamics and the ways that things are going. He thinks we're helping him, by the way. If you look at what they say, if America's going to have a quad of democracies, we should have a quad of autocracies. I think he sees himself there as the junior partner, like he understands that, but as the kind of ideological leader of trying to bring that together. To what extent that will happen, I hope it doesn't happen. I think it wouldn't be in anybody's interest, including even the Chinese, but that's a self-conception that he has in terms of that grand strategy. And then the second question I've already forgotten.
How risk acceptant do you think?
Oh yeah, right. I don't know. Let me just say that. And I would say, as somebody who wrestled with this in the US government, I am also skeptical that anybody knows. I'm going to put it that way, right? Which is to say, your job in the government, and if you work in the intelligence community, your job is to make assessments about questions like that. By the way, parenthetically, it always drove me nuts that you could only have three outcomes. You know, we have real confidence, medium confidence, low confidence. I've never understood why the IC only had three data points. You know, why can't it be 10? You know, push those guys a little harder. But and I would just say that we worked on that. I mean, I remember very vividly thinking about what Putin might do vis-a-vis Ukraine. And I was, you know, you always make your assessment and then you got to update it based on behavior. And I want to, you know, I need to be careful here about what I should talk about or not, but you would not be surprised, especially you, Aaron, because you've served in government, but many would not be surprised that when we were debating those issues, we had red team, blue team, you know, scenarios that we sketched out. So if somebody says to you, well, you know, I was there and most certainly that was one of the possibilities we were talking about, that is true. But, you know, in the US government, we do a lot of gaming and a lot of scenario building about really crazy kooky things all the time. And just to say that you thought about it did not mean that you thought it was going to happen. And I would just say, you know, I think about the list lately, 2014, that was riskier than I think the conventional wisdom at the time. 2015, the military intervention in Syria, that was bigger and bolder than we were predicting at the time. 2016 in the United States, that was so big and so bold that the people in charge in the government didn't even believe their own data at the time. These are people, I was out of the government at the time, but I know these people well. They honestly couldn't believe that they would do that. Skripal, right? So, which is to say that I think it's more today, it's riskier today than I would have said a decade ago. And at the same time, I don't, like I said, I think challenging NATO in particular is a red line for him that I would be surprised to see. So I gave you that scenario about Narva, but that's a 5% probability event, right? That's not a 50% in my view. Doing things in the non-NATO areas of Europe, however, I think he has intervened many times. He's got Russian soldiers in Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine right now. He feels pretty good about what he just did with respect to, now he's got soldiers, peacekeepers, you know, separating Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think he feels he, you know, orchestrated another coup in Kyrgyzstan. I think he feels pretty confident within that space that there are very few limits on what he can do.
Okay, shift direction just a little bit. And I guess the question might be, to what extent is the problem that the West has now with Russia a function of Putin personally, or the regime and the ideology, as you suggested, is created? So if Putin dropped dead tomorrow, first, what do you think would happen? Who might take his place? And what would be the prospects for some substantial shift in the direction of Russian domestic and international policy?
Yeah, tough, hard question that I don't know the answer to. And again, nobody else knows the answer to it either. So, you know, social scientists, I used to write quite a bit about democratic transitions, and I used to teach a course for decades here at Stanford on revolutions. And I would just say we've been pretty bad at predicting regime collapse over the decades. And my 5 years in the government, I was there for the Green Revolution in Iran, Arab Spring in 2011, mass mobilization against Putin in 2011, as I talked about, and Ukraine. And I would say we were pretty bad at predicting all of those events as well, as a government. So with that caveat in mind, let me take a stab at your question modestly. First, on the analytic side, you know, I'm struggling with this right now for this new book I'm writing. It's really hard to disentangle regime type and Putin because they correlate, right? So Russia was you know, in my view, a weak, unconsolidated electoral democracy. I wrote a book about it published in 2001, right at the beginning of Putin's time. 20 years later, Putin's been in power and Russia's much more autocratic. So it's hard to say, what's cause and effect here. It's Putin that has affected it, but regime and the individual here go hand in hand. I do, if I'm pressed to predict, if I'm speaking to a bunch of bankers and and they're paying me and they say, McFaul, you got to give us your bottom line. Here's the way I describe what I think will happen next. Well, two things. Let me start with the short term and then the longer term. The short term, the regime that is in place today will not collapse overnight. No way. It is a very effective autocratic regime, very sophisticated. And I'm happy to go into detail if people are interested in this. Here's where I radically disagree with, some others that think that it's barely holding on and, just a little push will collapse it. I do not believe that. And therefore, when Putin no longer can rule, or he doesn't want to rule, or he's incapacitated, I don't think he'll willingly step down. Although maybe, you never know with him. He likes to keep us guessing. And he appoints, his heir apparent, let's say for today, it's Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister. He was just out vacationing with Mr. Shoigu out in Siberia. They had matching suits on and drinking tea, and very obvious that they were signaling that he might be one of the heir apparents. I think Shoigu could run that system and it would last for a while, but I don't think it has really long-lasting capabilities for a couple of reasons. One, they don't have a communist party. They don't have the Communist Party of China. That's a huge, big advantage that President Xi and his regime has that Russia doesn't have. And their weak, feeble attempts to create that have not succeeded. Number two, they're not performing as an economy and in ways that people want. And the sugar high from invading Ukraine has worn off. If you look at opinion poll data, and remember, we have to treat that opinion poll data rather skeptically, given that it's an autocracy. But even, and I know all these polling firms are all run by friends of mine, but even in their data, you see decline. People are upset with the way, even if they're not upset with Putin, there are not that many people excited about the trajectory of Russia. And so that trajectory without Putin, I think, will be even more problematic for whoever takes over after him. And then third, there is, I believe, a much deeper split among elites in Russia than I think is conventionally recognized. And look at me using the passive tense to to kind of make that less explicit, because one tends to do that when talking about things that are hard to measure and hard to see, right? I've noticed that happens in the China debate about intentionality and splits, and as I read more about that, well, that most certainly is true when we look at decision making within the Russian state. But it's been my view that, this pivot away from the West that happened in 2014, yes, there is an inner circle around Putin that supported that wholeheartedly. And, and now we have pretty good data. It's been mostly in the public domain. They were all sitting around down in Sochi. It was during the Olympics, right? Remember, it was during the Russian Winter Olympics when he made that decision, that aggressive decision to go into Crimea. And by the way, they're all pumped up on nationalism at that time. They were doing well. And I use pumped up literally because they were pumped up on steroids to achieve those objectives. But, they won more medals than ever before. I was there. It was really fun, by the way, to be at the Olympics, politics aside. And when he was making those decisions, he was sitting around with what they call his Siloviki buddies, right? The hardliners, the people from the intelligence services, and the liberal internationalists, the people on his, the the people in running the economy at the time, they were not in the room. But that group still exists in Russia, and in the economy they still exist. And that group thinks that it was a tragic, stupid mistake to do what Putin did, and then the reaction that we have. And they feel like they've lost a decade. And I don't want to pretend that they're going to emerge overnight and take over, but they're there. And I think there'll be a more intra-elite struggle in the post-Putin era than a lot of people think about.
Ask a related question. To put it bluntly, to what extent, if at all, should the United States, should the West be attempting to encourage regime change? You mentioned the importance of promulgating liberal democratic ideas. Of course, as you suggest, as seen by Putin, whatever we do or say on that front is intended to undermine his regime. But what, if anything, should we be doing to try to encourage a shift in a more liberal direction over time?
Well, it's a very hard question because, as I said before, that system has become much more sophisticated. And so, NGOs that were involved in, supporting democracy. I used to work for one decades ago called NDI, the National Democratic Institute. They've been all pushed out of Russia. Even high school exchanges, you'd think that'd be pretty innocuous. It's called the Flex program. Putin shut that down. RFERL is battling for its life right now to keep its office in Moscow. And the system has become much more sophisticated through technological capabilities of monitoring behavior within Russia, monitoring behavior outside of Russia. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russian government is with us right now. In fact, I would be shocked if they weren't. As well as, intelligence infiltration of anything that looks like a challenge to Putin. I just think they're very sophisticated at that. And I probably shouldn't say more than that, other than just do not underestimate their powers in that domain space, which makes our ability to do anything in that space difficult. And so, what I say, I just echo something that a good friend of mine who tragically was assassinated in 2015, Boris Nemtsov, he used to always say this, and I think it's wise. In fact, he even said it now I'm remembering. He said it when he met with Obama in 2009, the same day that from that photo that I showed you when we were meeting with Putin. It was a meeting of opposition leaders. By the way, people forget, but that's what we were doing in 2009. The president of the United States was meeting with Russian opposition leaders, and it was no big deal because it was a different era, right? Putin didn't like it, but Medvedev thought it was perfectly fine. And that's another part of that intra-elite thing I was alluding to. Like, remember Medvedev, and he's a pathetic, character that's faded away and just through corruption. By the way, another great, impressive tool that Putin uses all the time to squelch opposition and to co-opt and then to coerce people. But back then, there was that divide was much more apparent. And I remember very vividly, Medvedev said, no big deal that you meet with these guys. I meet with them too. That would never happen today. Or Putin would never talk that way. But Nemtsov said this, various people were saying what we should do to help them in this meeting. And some, by the way, I'm reminded of this older literature about, what is useful and not, what helped to bring about regime change in the Soviet Union. One of the people in that room, by the way, made the argument that I think is very persuasive about a benign international environment makes their cause easier to develop. And he was focused on like missile defense, and don't be, if you pressure us, that makes it harder for us. And I think, maybe we should come back to that later in the day. I'm still wrestling with, engagement versus coercion. And I know the cases pretty well, and it's not black and white. Sometimes engagement creates that benign environment. Most certainly, Reagan's engagement of Gorbachev helped to create permissive conditions for democratic development in Russia and Ukraine and Estonia. I don't think that's a strategy we can pursue, because I don't think Putin's interested, but maybe it will be in the future. But the one thing Nemtsov said I think is important. He said, look, I don't want your help. I don't want your money. We don't want your money. I'm a proud Russian. I don't want to be called a puppet of the West. I just want you to stop helping our enemies. And that really took Obama by, it's like, what do you mean? We're not helping anybody's enemies. And that's when he went into and this is a long time ago, by the way. That's when he went into a long kind of discussion about, stolen money from Russia, invested in London, invested in New York and Florida, where because we don't pay attention to this, we're indirectly helping the enemies of democracy and enemies of liberalism. And I think in that's a domain space that we could do more of. And then just, as I alluded to in my talk, I don't think we should be overtly in the business of regime change vis-a-vis Russia. I do not. I think we don't know how to do that, and it would be counterproductive. I think we should be in the business of supporting ideas, ideas about democracy, ideas about liberalism, call it education, and think about modalities to do that in a way that is much more intellectual, even, I would say, and less, about, fomenting regime change or not.
Well, we only have a few minutes, but we have lots of additional questions. So let me try to get in at least one or two more. And let's focus a little bit on the external aspects of US and Western policy for dealing with Russia. One obvious issue is Russian success in using disinformation to destabilize and confuse democratic societies. How should the United States and other Western countries respond to that challenge?
Man, these are not easy questions at 7:30 in the morning. Well, number one, as I alluded to earlier, we really underestimated this back in 2016. And I would say back in 2014 in Ukraine, they've been dealing with this, and we could go even farther back, but especially Ukraine, big explosion. And it hasn't dissipated. I want to be clear about that. In many ways, the new President Zelensky, he brought in a pretty fantastic reform team, by the way, when he came in, and he hired this young prime minister, Goncharuk is his name. And many people that came into that government are people I know well. And I don't want to say that it was Russian disinformation that was the single cause of that government collapsing, but was it a contributing factor? The answer is absolutely yes. And again, the details we don't have time to get into, but they've got a really sophisticated strategy for doing this stuff. And by the way, Zelensky's finally decided to push back, and that may be what's prompted this new, the new rumblings of Russian military activity on his border. I mean, he's decided that he made a mistake, and he's trying to push back, and that's all connected to this disinformation stuff happening inside Ukraine. I guess I would say, one, recognize it for what it is, and we weren't doing that before, and now, where I live out here, I deal with the platform companies pretty often, and they have made progress in identifying. First, just labeling, that's new. That was an idea that we worked with Twitter and YouTube on for many, many years, and that's good. Two, identifying what they call CIB, coordinated inauthentic behavior, and taking that down, that's good. But then three, and this is the harder part, we have to have not just a defensive strategy, we've got to have a more offensive strategy of saying what we believe in, not just the crap that they're throwing into our system. And that's because, remember, this is different than the Cold War period, in my view. Putin has a dual track strategy. On the one hand, he's propagating his ideas very clearly and unabashedly, by the way. You know, I know the head of RT. I've known Margarita for 20 years. If she were on this call, she would say, you know, my job is to support the Russian state. She's not going to dance around that and pretend, you know, that's what they do. And that's what they're paid for. And the money, their giant budgets do that. But in addition, they have this anti-information, anti-evidence, anti-fact. You know, he wants to make everything a whataboutism debate, that there is no truth. And I think we have to more proactively deal with that. This is something when I was ambassador, we debated all the time. There was always this view that, oh, we should never engage in this. When they put out disinformation, we should just leave it, because if you do it, you know, it's called feeding the trolls. That's what we call it all the time now, right? I remember, for instance, a video was circulated about me that suggested I was a pedophile, right? So what do you do with that? Do you respond? Do you not? We didn't respond to that directly because we didn't want to feed the trolls. But I've changed my views on that. I think we say that too often, and we don't get proactively engaged. And I think we need to be much more proactively engaged across all the platforms that the U.S. government controls. But in addition, then, in the kind of debate about facts that take place in the public spaces, especially in places, not just in the United States, but especially in places like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, where I just think we're very absent in those debates right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots more to discuss, but I think our time is up. So Professor McFaul, I really want to thank you for getting us off to an excellent start. If we were in normal times, the room would be filled with applause. Now, I guess they're just the little hands that appear. But thank you so much. It's really been great. I hope you'll be able to stay with us for at least part of the rest of the day. But again, thank you for your remarks. Bailey, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And we're so happy that we got to hear from this wonderful keynote speaker today. So we will be closing this Zoom call, but in 15 minutes at 10:45, we'll be starting our first panel. So you can just use the same link again. And we will see you all then, hopefully. Thank you.